Okay, I'm Delyth Wall. I'm Head of Science at Tenbury High, Ormiston Academy.
Deth, you were talking about some really interesting stuff about literacy, sort of cross-curriculum within science, and it'd be interesting just to hear you talk about that and some of the impact you think that's had.
Mm-hmm. So we've developed an extended writing mat together with the English department and Humanities department, which is a resource that we use in lessons. It will help pupils unpick the command terms of questions, so what it is they've got to do to answer a question, and also sequencing through. It's trying to get a common sort of structure, a common method and common terminology between different departments, so that pupils kind of bring their skills from everywhere to a lesson rather than just thinking it works in that own little box and nothing else.
Can you give us examples of some of that? I know this might seem obvious, some example of some of those command terms.
Yeah, so for example it might be to evaluate. So on the sheet itself it's got evaluate, it's got some words that you would need to use in your answer, so some sort of sentence starters on there, and the fact that for science you've got to do your advantages, disadvantages and a justified conclusion in order to gain the full set of marks for a question.
And how far down the school are you beginning to teach that, and what impact do you think it had on the GCSE results last year?
We've started using it right from year 7. So we will get them to do an extended piece of writing using the mats, and then we use it right throughout the school. Started using it last year due to weaker performance in 6-mark questions in the exam, and then from the analysis of the summer results it's made a massive improvement in the attainment on those 6-mark questions.
Brilliant, thank you. And you were talking to me before about the ways in which you try and make lessons engaging, particularly in Key Stage 3, and I think you gave an example of a lesson about rocks.
Yeah, so for some pupils there will be topics that aren't exciting and it switches them off and they just don't engage in the learning. So for a lesson where we're learning about different types of rocks, I will give them a post-it note as they're walking in through the door, and on the board is the instruction, draw yourself if you were a rock. So in that they've got to use some scientific knowledge because they've got to think about who they are as a person and their own sort of properties, and then the properties of a rock, and match it up. So they are still learning about it, but they're suddenly engaged and they're excited about it.
Okay. And you're particularly talking about, within Key Stage 4, the use of sort of careful use of information for high ability students, particularly on exam questions and developing exam technique.
Yeah. So we try not to give pupils too much information. Sometimes higher ability students just want to sort of come in, sit in a lesson and have knowledge given to them rather than actually learn it themselves and understand it themselves. So we might take the approach of giving an exam question at the start of a lesson that we know full well that they won't be able to do completely. They might be able to do aspects of it, but not all of it. And then through the lesson, we would then give them a little bit more information, and we'd model answers, and I'd question them as to, okay, so what's happening here, why do you think that's happening, and start to build up a response. And then we would end the lesson by giving them the same question. They would then answer it, and they can see their improvement from the start of the lesson to the end, and the knowledge that they've gained themselves. So it's really about the students leading the learning.
I mean, that all sounds fantastic, and in particular use as well of extension activities as well. So you talked about the way in which extension activities relate to the content that students are learning, and also about the ragging process for learning outcomes or learning processes during a lesson.
So outcomes and tasks can be RAG rated, and pupils understand that the green tasks are lower demand, amber tasks are more sort of standard, and then red tasks are a higher demand. We might put in a killer rather than extension. We call it a killer, which is the purple question or task. Because sometimes with students, if you sort of say, oh, well done, you've done that work, here's an extension worksheet. Ultimately, if that was me, I'd sit back and go, oh, I've just kind of been a little bit punished for doing this work, so I might not do it as quickly the next time. So what we do is give them a killer task, or we try and prompt them with questions that actually gets them to have a wider knowledge about a topic rather than just going, here's something else to do. It's really unpicking content so that they get a much deeper understanding of it.
So could you give a concrete example of that? So what students would perhaps be learning, the bulk of the students would be learning during a lesson, and an example of how you would extend them with a killer task?
Yeah. So the bulk of the students might be learning about diffusion of, say, perfume. So you'd spray perfume and you'd then unpick how it's sort of travelling across the room, why it does that. And you'd link in your knowledge of your particle models with that. That's where most pupils would sit. You'd then build it up by getting pupils to think about the behaviour of the particles, and then you would build it again by actually linking it into real life examples that are slightly more abstract. So instead of spraying perfume that they can see, they can smell it, they can understand it clearly, you might say, okay, let's apply this to the alveoli in the lungs, which is something that they can't see, and it is getting them to sort of apply their knowledge to multiple examples.
But the key thing as well there is that you're not taking them, in a sense, beyond what is the core content of that lesson.
Yeah.
It's making sure that that is really understood in depth.
Yeah.
And I suppose you could also add perhaps then evaluative questions beyond that as a sort of killer task to say, well, okay, compare the uses of these two things as perhaps further additional questions.
Yeah, so it might be that you would look at a healthy alveoli and a damaged alveoli, and you'd get them to compare the structures and then apply their knowledge of diffusion as to which one would be best for diffusion and then the impacts of that on the body.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing the lesson in a few minutes.
Thank you.